Finally, then, in this chapter, he gives us an argument for methodological naturalism and against intelligent design. And what is that argument? Well, it's the God of the gaps charge against intelligent design. So he wants to deal with that in the latter part of this particular chapter. And so he says to close out this chapter appropriately, there is one argument that serves double duty, he tells us, to which he should respond. It provides an argument for methodological naturalism and against intelligent design. So it's double duty.
And a positive negative. There we
That's
go.
right. He says some critics object that intelligent design models utilize a strategy that can be called, here it is, as we mentioned, the God of the gaps approach, which is an intellectually inappropriate move. So there, right? And thus one should stick to methodological naturalism and abandon intelligent design because of this God of the gaps objection.
Right, right. Thunder and lightning is not the angels bowling. You know, we know the positive and negative ions now, and so you've just moved one back. You used to have angels and God as a explanation, and so if we just keep moving back and back and back, then you have no reason to explain God, and we've explained everything through these naturalistic means. That's kind of how the argument goes against us. Well, this argument usually takes the following form of this. 1, God acts only when there are gaps in nature. And 2, God is applied to merely to fill up gaps in our scientific knowledge and cover our ignorance of naturalistic mechanisms. We didn't know what lightning and thunder was before. Now we do. God gets thrown out. Real science gets replaced. Well, let's just do that a number of times. 3, there are gaps that are used in apologetic natural theology arguments to support Christian theism. 4, scientific progress is making these gaps increasingly rare, and thus 5, this strategy is not a good one. And he says several things may be said against this criticism.
All right, so what are they? Well, first, and now he's going to kind of give us a list of these things and explain them. So what's the problem with the God of the gaps thing with regard to arguing against intelligent design? Well, he says the first problem here within the intelligent design model is that God's causal activity in this model is clearly not limited to gaps, right? It goes more than just filling gaps. God constantly and actively sustains and governs the universe at all times. Nature is not autonomous. And so it's more God's activity is the whole shebang, right? Everything. It's not just has to do with gaps, right? He says, moreover, intelligent design theory need not have any apologetic aim at all, right? In other words, it can be an explanation without trying to show that God exists. It can suggest that only, there's some intelligence in back of what we're experiencing. And so he says a Christian theist or even a Muslim, for that matter, may simply believe that he or she should consult all that we know or have reason to believe is true, including theological beliefs in forming, evaluating, and testing scientific theories and in explaining scientific phenomena. So let's look at the whole book and not just limited to the first 3 chapters, right? We want to look at the whole book. And so if we look at the whole book, we should include intelligence as part of our array of explaining things and not just throw that out because we're afraid that we might let, God in, right? That's what he said.
So again, when someone says, well, you're just trying to sneak God in, no, they're trying to sneak God into the scientific explanation. We're just trying to do science all on our own. So you have your science, we'll have our science as well, which is the same science, and we can do science together. It's one side that wants to kick out the other side here. Well, second, the model does not attempt to explain things in light of God and his activities in order to cover our ignorance, but only when positive, good theological, philosophical, and especially scientific reasons are present. An intelligent design theory clearly is justified in appealing to an agent cause, God, instead of a purely material cause. When the effect being explained satisfies the design filler, the effect is highly improbable, and the effect is independently specifiable. It can be picked out as a special effect besides the simple fact that it took place. Again, we have people like Lawrence Krauss who realize that nothing is a big problem for them. That nothing exploded, and so they're always trying to find something to fill the nothing. So therefore, you just have a nothing of the gaps. Right? And you're just trying to fill it. Well, we're trying to fill it with answers. Yes, but at some point in time, you either have to assume that, the universe is in some solid state, initial point that it formed everything, or you have to assume that, that something literally does come from nothing, and that goes against the entire scientific framework. But again, non-life produces life. Well, it rained on the rocks for millions of years, lightning struck it, and all of a sudden the thing that Miller and Urey had to kind of fudge in their experiment to create three different, little building blocks, we know didn't happen in that world. But here we showed three in this very highly controlled area, but this was able to produce all life, that was able to produce computers and skyscrapers and AI that would eventually take us over. And so now when AI controls us and sees, well, where did we come from? Are they going to view nothing as something as well? Well, I think that's a null set for them, and they might short circuit then, which might free us. So that's Lawrence Krauss to save the day from us. But again, you have a nothing problem as well. You have a gap problem, and you're filling it with nothing, which you make into something, but then you just move the problem one forward back. And again, that seems like a God of the gaps argumentation as well. Well, you're just filling it with something, but it doesn't, it gets filled with something. So then you have to take another step back. And so is that the God of the gaps argument there?
So this particular point that he's making is I think an interesting one. He's suggesting here that the whole idea of intelligent design isn't to cover our ignorance, right? We're not gapping or whatever. He says we only suggest intelligent design when a particular explanation satisfies what he calls the design filter, right? And, I remember reading, William Dembski has done a lot of work on this idea of the design filter, right? Where how can we determine if a particular event is part of a design? And he gives us these various criteria. So J.P. Moreland looks at least two of these with regard to the design filter. The effect is highly improbable, right? That is, it didn't have to happen. It's highly improbable. And the effect is independently specifiable, right? So that we can, independent of the effect, specify a particular event, right? That is, it can be picked out as a special effect because the simple fact is that it took place, right? So, if you're playing a particular card game and you get the best hand, and every time the dealer deals, he gets the best hand. Well, you begin to think, wait a minute, what's going on? Well, how do we know what the best hand is? Well, we can independently specify what that hand is in that particular game. And so this notion then of highly improbable and specificity is part of what he calls a design filter. And so that's what he's getting at. So if something, right, kind of allows us, as we work through this design filter and it meets the criteria there, then that gives us a good reason to believe that it was designed. All right, so that's the second one. Thirdly, then, even if the gaps in naturalistic scientific explanations are getting smaller, this does not prove that there are no gaps at all. Right? He says it begs the question to argue that just because most alleged gaps turn out to be explanatory in terms of naturalistic terms, without gaps at the level of explanation, then all the alleged gaps turn out this way, right? In other words, we're eliminating gaps and therefore probably there will be no gaps. Well, he says that's not a good argument. He says, after all, what else would one expect of a gap but that there would be few of them, right? So the gaps is a way of, we plug God into the gaps because it looks as if this is a miracle. Well, that's the nature of miracles. They're few and far between, right? Gaps, he says, due to primary divine agency, are miracles that are in the minority, he tells us, for at least a couple of reasons. And so, yes, we would expect some of these to be unexplanatory because God has directly, right, intervened.
Right. So, you do a puzzle and you should just be able to lay them out. And the gap you're telling me requires this specific piece at this time from an intelligent hand. Well, no, they're just pieces. If you shake the box up enough, it'll put itself together eventually. I mean, you'll have to do it for billions of years and, eventually it will happen. So, just stick enough time and shake up enough box. Well, who shakes the box? Well, it shakes itself. And so therefore that's all we need.